It is absolutely insane to see the numbers and realize that not only was he one of the best big play threats in all of football last year, he was one of the most consistent deep threats in all of football last year. But is it going to keep up in 2024? Yo, Headliner Nation, today's video is going to be all about big time wide receivers. Listen, normally our fantasy championships are going to be won on the backs of our most consistent players. But to get to those fantasy championships, we have to take our team of consistency and sprinkle in a little bit of risk and upside along with it. And wide receivers who offer us big time plays are a great way to do that. But who were some of the best big time wide receivers in all the NFL last year? If you've been around a while, you know here at the Fantasy Headliners, we love to dive deep with statistics. And me personally, I love trying to formulate them in a way that shows us a potential outcome that can help us target specific players throughout our draft process. And if you like what you see in this video, you're gonna find a lot of this information expanded on in our draft guide, which is now live and available for you to be diving into right now. One of the largest collections of fantasy football knowledge that you can get your hands on in the industry, and it's for an extremely low price of only $21.99. And if you want to get your electronic copy right now that updates all throughout the offseason and up until week 1 of the regular season, click on the link in the description below, head on over to our website, purchase yours, and get ready to dominate all of your fantasy leagues. But today we're going to be diving into 8 different categories of statistics that I feel like really help us determine which of the wide receivers in the NFL are some of the best big play wide receivers. And at the end, we're going to average everything out and give each player a score and use that score to determine whether or not they are actually a big time wide receiver that we need to be drafting, or if there's just way too many inconsistencies with their game. All right, our first stat is going to be targets, and all of these numbers are based on targets that went more than 20 yards down the field. So these statistics are not going to take into account any passes or completions that happened before the 20-yard mark. That's why this is truly all about big play wide receivers. Some of you are going to see DeAndre Hopkins' name and you're going to be shocked that he led the league in targets of 20 or more yards down the field. But if you've been paying attention to our videos this offseason, you've already heard me mention multiple times that Will Levis led the league last season in percentage of targets that went 20 or more yards down the field. This Tennessee offense was not playing around last year. They were taking shots down the field. But will that continue with a new offensive mind at the helm? And for the 20 wide receivers listed on the screen right now, this is the top 20 wide receivers and targets for this category. I didn't expand much outside of that because when you get down to it, when you start looking at guys like Justin Watson that you see at the bottom of the list, those type of guys are not going to be ones that generally we're very concerned about in a fantasy aspect. But I'm not necessarily shocked about anybody at the top of this list either. I do think one name that caught me off guard a little bit was DJ Moore. And I think you're going to see this trend continue for DJ Moore in 2024 because Keenan Allen is going to be a guy that's really going to roam over the middle of the field, maybe playing out of the slot a lot more than what DJ Moore will. And Rome Odunze and DJ Moore are going to be guys that take some shots down the field. So DJ Moore being inside the top 20 of 20 plus yard targets next season, definitely very realistic. And I wouldn't be surprised if he's up near the top once again. One guy that is likely to improve on his numbers in this category is going to be George Pickens, because with Russell Wilson leading the team now, I definitely would imagine George Pickens seeing some more consistent targets down the field than what we saw with any of the quarterbacks last season. And there's one name that I want to mention here right now. If you see him on the screen, Amari Cooper tied for 14th. Keep that name in mind as we keep moving through some of these categories. All right, let's go ahead and move on to receptions now. And really not a shock for anyone that Tyreek Hill is right up here at the top of this list. Now, there are a couple of names at the top of this list that were also up here in terms of targets. So it kind of correlates over. The more targets you receive, the more receptions you will likely have. But then we take a look at our leader in targets and realize DeAndre Hopkins has fallen all the way down to number 8 in terms of receptions. And there could be multiple reasons for that, but at the end of the day, probably some of it is just that those targets weren't all catchable. And when you start driving the ball 20 or more yards down the field, accuracy for most quarterbacks starts to become a little bit of an issue. So does Will Levis improve on some of that accuracy? Because if he does, and they continue to push the ball down the field, Hopkins could see a decent amount of targets once again, and maybe some of those turn into more receptions. But we also need to keep in mind that Calvin Ridley, who is also showing up on this list and 6 in those receptions last year, is now on the same team. So Hopkins may be displaced as that deep threat a little bit. If they continue to throw it deep, there could be enough to go around. But hopefully the efficiency for DeAndre Hopkins would pick up, even if we see some of those targets start to drop a little bit. But then we have some really big risers in this category, meaning maybe they didn't get as many targets as some of these other wide receivers, but they made the most of those targets and ended up putting together a pretty decent performance in terms of receptions. CeeDee Lamb would be one of those guys because he was 9th in targets, but 3rd in receptions of 20 or more yards down the field. And his big play potential, we know, is all over the place. And I like this balance because CeeDee Lamb is not a big play wide receiver in my mind. He is not a guy that we want consistently running go routes. We want him all over the field. We want him getting those targets all over the field and then using his athleticism after the catch. So if the targets don't go up, I'm okay with that because the efficiency should still be there. Justin Jefferson is the biggest riser in this category because he was 14th in targets, but he's all the way up here tied for 4th in receptions. And then a name that I just mentioned, Amari Cooper, who was tied in targets with Justin Jefferson, only had 1 less reception. And it's crazy to think that Justin Jefferson did that good, especially considering the fact when Kirk Cousins was lost last season and who his quarterbacks were the rest of the year. But when you take a look at the biggest faller here, it's Chris Olave, who is 4th in targets, but has dropped all the way down to 15th in receptions. And I have shared a lot of my concerns about Chris Olave, not only this offseason, but last season as well. Because when you watch Chris Olave on tape, a lot of times the Saints just utilized him as a go wide receiver down the field. Run a go route, Derek Carr is going to throw it up to you, and we hope that you can do something about it. And that did not always work well. My hope is that Chris Olave is on the same career path as CeeDee Lamb, because CeeDee Lamb was kind of the same way when he came into the league, especially when Dallas had Amari Cooper still. They were just kind of running CeeDee Lamb on a bunch of go routes and expecting him to be that type of receiver. But now over the last couple of years, they've started moving him around the formation more, expanding his route tree, and letting him become a complete wide receiver. Chris Olave's growth is going to depend on the Saints doing that same thing for him in 2024. All right, now let's take a look at total receiving yards on those targets 20 or more yards down the field. Tyreek Hill had the most receptions. No shock that he's up here with the most receiving yards. But we've got some risers in this category as well. And one of those things that we have to take a look at is efficiency in this category. And we're going to see some more stats here in a minute that help us really hammer that home. But in my opinion, the less targets that you get and the less receptions that you get are okay. But if you're putting in a ton of yards on top of it, that means you're being really, really efficient in that category. But you could be a guy with a ton of targets and they just don't turn into anything. And that's where you see like a guy in CeeDee Lamb who was 3rd in those targets but 6th in receiving yards. You really start to fully understand that, yeah, he's going to have some bigger plays over the top of the field, but he really does his best work in the middle intermediate part of the field. But one of the biggest risers in this category, once again, Amari Cooper, who was 5th in receptions, but finished 2nd in receiving yards. But realistically, outside of those two names, when you look at the last two categories, receptions and receiving yards, they're pretty even across the board. If you had a high amount of receptions, you typically had a higher amount of receiving yards. If you have a lower amount of receptions, you typically had a lower amount of receiving yards. But now let's go ahead and dive into one of our last volume categories, which will be touchdowns. Now there are some pretty significant movers in this category as well, because we just talked about the correlation between receptions to receiving yards and how it's pretty even across the board. but receptions and receiving yards don't always equal touchdowns. But you have a group of guys like Calvin Ridley, Gabe Davis, and Devontae Smith, who finished 10th, 11th, and 12th in receptions, but they finished tied for 4th in touchdowns on targets 20 or more yards down the field. And again, I want to reiterate, the target itself is 20 or more yards down the field. So if there was a target that was 10 yards down the field and one of these guys took it to the house, it doesn't count in this category. The target itself has to be deeper. But then you see a guy like DK Metcalf, who ranked 9th in receptions, but is all the way down at the bottom of this list after having only one touchdown last year that was 20 or more yards down the field. And Tyler Lockett did not finish very well in this category either, after being one of the better big play wide receivers in all of football over the last several seasons. And you have to wonder if things for Geno Smith have started to wear off. That Cinderella story, comeback player of the year a couple of years ago, may be coming to a close. And that's where Sam Howell could step in and help boost some of these numbers for both of those guys. All right, our first efficiency category is yards per route run. Essentially, that means on targets of 20 or more yards down the field, how many yards on average are being picked up on those routes that are ran. And lo and behold, look at who is at the top of the list once again. It's Amari Cooper. And if you haven't guessed it by now, probably by the end of this show, you're going to see that Amari Cooper was definitely one of the better big play wide receivers in all of football. But a guy that we just talked about a second ago, George Pickens, is a really big breakout candidate for a lot of people this season. And last year, maybe I was a year too early because I had him listed as a breakout myself. And he had some good games, but he was not consistent enough. Russell Wilson in the past has been known as one of the best deep ball quarterbacks in all the NFL. And we can only hope that in 2024, we see some vintage Russell Wilson once again, because if we do, George Pickens should experience a lot more volume. And if he keeps up with the efficiency portion of it, he definitely could have that breakout season that a lot of people are hoping for. Another player that I definitely have some concerns about this year is Davante Adams. And when you take a look at the statistics that he's put together so far, nothing really stands out on his deep ball ability. And now that we're going to be looking at Gardner Minshew and or Aiden O'Connell being the starting quarterback for Las Vegas this season, I don't know if it gets a whole lot better. Now, Gardner Minshew definitely has had his time in the spotlight over the last couple of years, and he has made some guys fantasy productible. You know, Michael Pittman last year had a pretty decent season. But when you take a look at his ability to continuously just go down the field, that's where I become concerned. And if this team gets a little too one-dimensional, they might take some shots down the field. But again, the efficiency portion of it, where we see Davante Adams at the lower end of this list, could end up staying the same. All right, moving on to average depth of target. So for those targets 20 or more yards down the field, how deep do they typically end up being? And it's really interesting to see a pair of teammates in here with Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown. And now that they've added Saquon Barkley to the backfield, who should show a little bit more consistency than what we saw from DeAndre Swift last season, they could definitely end up being up there in this category again. And neither of them have had bad numbers in this scenario, and we'll take a look at what their average score is at the end of the video. But for both of these guys, hopefully this type of efficiency just continues to build up with volume, gets even better. A.J. Brown finds himself inside the top 10 once again, and Devontae Smith, even though he may have some inconsistencies because he's not the wide receiver one, will have some big games to win you some big weeks. Now, Stefon Diggs isn't going to have Josh Allen just throwing it up to him at any random point in time this season, but he does have C.J. Stroud. And the biggest thing for Stefon Diggs this season is the fact that he's going to be in an offense with a lot of weapons around him. Something in Buffalo they didn't really surround Diggs with. They had some good players here or there, but on offense, they didn't have consistent high leverage weapons like Nico Collins, Tank Dell, and Joe Mixon in the backfield now for the Houston Texans. Caliber of quarterback, it's going to be about on par. CJ Stroud is right up there with Josh Allen. And even if Stefon Diggs' targets end up coming down a little bit this season, he could really still be a good fantasy asset if the efficiency can stay the same. Now, we talked about CeeDee Lamb a couple of times in this video already, and you see his name at the bottom of this category, but I actually don't mind that because, again, like I have said with CeeDee Lamb, I don't think he's the type of typical big play wide receiver that's just on the outside to run those go routes. I like seeing his average depth of target a little bit on the lower side amongst these names, because when he's higher in certain categories like targets or receptions or receiving yards or receiving touchdowns or anything like that, it means he's being utilized down the field, which is great. But when that average depth of target is a little bit on the lower side, it means that his route tree is still allowing him to run those slants, outs, and different type of drag routes that keep him in the middle of the field and allow him to use that explosiveness after the catch. And that kind of applies to Garrett Wilson as well, who I hope sees a big jump in production this year with Aaron Rodgers, fingers crossed, healthy for an entire season. Once again, Garrett Wilson, like Chris Olave, like CeeDee Lamb, I do not believe is better suited for just running on the outside and limiting his route tree. I believe they need to move him around the formation, give him different routes over the middle of the field, to the side of the field, deep down the field, and use that explosiveness after the catch to create yards, opportunity, and points. So seeing his average depth of target here on the lower side, again, is something that I am okay with, and I actually think benefits him quite a bit. There is one stat that I really feel like is not utilized enough in the NFL, especially in our industry when we're trying to look at big play potential. For those of you that have been around for a while, you know my dynamic running back rating that is in our draft guide in an exclusive tool that nobody has access to except people who buy our draft guide. And I really like to utilize yards after contact, yards after reception, things like that within that formula, because it shows me players that are going to be picking up those extra yards and doing things after the catch that makes them explosive and big play players. Now, when you take a look at yards after the catch per reception on these big plays, it also shows us the ability to not only get up and win those one-on-one battles, but to win those battles down the field and continue to pick up even more yards after the catch. And once again, who would have guessed Amari Cooper would have finished this high in this category as well? I really hope Deshaun Watson can come back and be healthy and what he used to be when he was in Houston. George Pickens finishing third here, not really that surprising. We know that he had some big plays after the catch last season, but the hope is that he continues it and he doesn't become a one-dimensional wide receiver that when he makes those one-on-one contested catches, he goes down right away. And I think there is another interesting aspect for us to discuss a little bit, and that's for the number one wide receivers in their offense, maybe not always performing well in this category, especially if they don't have a ton of weapons around them. Because once again, you take a look at guys like Stefon Diggs, Garrett Wilson, Terry McLaurin, they're not surrounded by a bunch of high leverage weapons on the other side. And because of that, they may face a lot of double coverage. And even though the quarterback is getting the ball up to him down the field, they're not able to go through that process and pick up a lot of yards after the catch because maybe they win the one-on-one matchup, but there's always going to be someone there to still bring them down right afterwards. All right, one last category to look at here, and it's contested catches. So when we're talking about throwing the ball 20 or more yards down the field, on those contested catches where you're winning a 1v1 or a 1v2 and needing to go up and high point the ball and use your athleticism and strength to win that battle, some of these guys, when you take a look at contested catches, we really find the potential for breakout here. And that's one of the reasons why I like Chris Olave, because he does such a good job fighting through the catch. And that's why he needs to be utilized in the intermediate portion of the field even more. He's good down the field, but those contested catches over the middle of the field where he can use his athleticism and burst to get out in the open and pick up extra yards is really going to make him the type of receiver that could climb the rankings really, really quick. It is super concerning that I see George Pickens with a 0 next to his name, especially given how athletic he is down the field with some of these catches that we see. He just doesn't do a good enough job fighting through the catch sometimes. All right, now we've come to our final score. score. And essentially what this score is, it's an average of where all of these wide receivers finished in all 8 categories. So the lower the number, the higher you finished across the board. And the lower the number means that these wide receivers were able to stay consistent in multiple areas of big play potential and not just had one area where they were really good and maybe slacked off in some different areas. And maybe 4 of the top 5 are no surprise to anybody, but I already mentioned Amari Cooper to you all. And to see him right here is absolutely crazy because I don't think he got enough love for what he did last year. It is absolutely insane to see the numbers and realize that not only was he one of the best big play threats in all of football last year, he was one of the most consistent deep threats in all of football last year. But is it going to keep up in 2024? And DJ Moore may be a little bit of a surprise to everybody as well. And we mentioned him at the start of the video where yes, he was targeted deep down the field quite a bit last season, maybe a little bit more than we expected with Justin Fields. But with Caleb Williams there now and maybe some more consistency in the passing game, especially down the field, it could lead to some bigger overall numbers, which means DJ Moore, even if he loses out on some volume to the other guys that are on the team now with Rome Odunze, Cole Kmet still being there, Keenan Allen, DeAndre Swift, if his efficiency gets even better, still some big fantasy points for him. And Mike Evans leads the way. We didn't talk about Mike Evans a whole lot over the course of this video because he wasn't super high in any one category and he wasn't super low in any one category. He was literally the most consistent when you talked about big play potential. And that's with Baker Mayfield, a guy that a lot of people look at and don't think he is a big time quarterback, but he plays like one. And he did last season quite a bit with Mike Evans. If we can get a bounce back from Chris Godwin, if the run game can stay efficient, David Canales being gone does give me a little bit of concern for Tampa Bay, but if they keep things going, Mike Evans could be a big time producer once again. And nobody is surprised by Tyreek Hill or AJ Brown being this high, but it's good to see AJ Brown this high because hopefully it helps reinforce to everybody he is still the wide receiver 1 on that team, and Devontae Smith has a time and place, but it's not as good as what AJ Brown is. Out of the second tier of wide receivers here, the one guy we talked about probably the least in this video was Calvin Ridley. He was mentioned a couple of different times, and it's going to be interesting to see the role that he plays in this offense for the Tennessee Titans. Now, their offensive coordinator was the passing game coordinator for Jacksonville last year, so he's familiar with Calvin Ridley and his skill set. And DeAndre Hopkins falls right in this area as well, who is his new teammate. So it'll be interesting to see that dynamic this year, and if Will Levis continues to push the ball down the field as much as we saw last season. Calvin Ridley to me feels a lot like last year again though. A guy that is going to have some huge games. He's going to win you some weeks, but he feels like a much better best ball type of player than he does a consistent fantasy contributor in like redraft leagues. Because in redraft leagues, it's going to be good to have some of those high upside guys, even if they bring some inconsistencies. But when you take a look at a guy like Calvin Ridley, who would have like 6 wide receiver 1 games last year, but then have 6 games where he wasn't even fantasy viable, that's a little bit too much of a roller coaster for my liking in redraft leagues. And I think the same thing can be said about DK Metcalf and Devontae Smith. You're going to see some inconsistencies with both of those guys. Devontae Smith, it's because he's got A.J. Brown as his number 1. You still got Dallas Goedert, and you've added Saquon Barkley. So some of the efficiency things will still be good, but the volume may not end up being there, and it's what makes him inconsistent at times. And then when you take a look at DK Metcalf, what is that going to look like? Geno Smith this year. You've got Tyler Lockett. You've got JSN. You've got a really strong run game with Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet. So efficiency-wise, we need to get him to be to a point where he's a lot better on the catches and the targets that he does get. Some people might look at this group and look at CeeDee Lamb and be like, oh, I expected him to be a lot higher. But it's the same thing that I have continued to mention. I am okay with him being a lot lower on this list because it means that he is making an impact in different parts of the field where he's a lot better anyway. And I really hope that that continues for him because if it does, he's still going to be a super strong fantasy producer. Gabe Davis is in a new home with Jacksonville this year, but they also drafted Brian Thomas Jr. So Gabe Davis, how many looks does he actually get on the outside? Is he going to be the wide receiver 3? Is Christian Kirk going to play in the slot the entire time and will go ahead and play Brian Thomas on the outside? How many realistic targets does Gabe Davis have? Or is he going to be more of just a field stretcher and once again, more worthy of a best ball pick? Chris Olave, once again, I want to see him lower on this list like CeeDee Lamb is because it means he's making an impact elsewhere. Except New Orleans isn't really using him elsewhere right now, so we need to fix that in 2024. I think both George Pickens and Terry McLaurin will see a bump in their value this year, and will end up finishing higher on this list next season with new quarterbacks that should get the ball to them a little bit more consistently down the field. All right, there are some big-time names here at the bottom of the list that quite honestly should be a lot higher, and there's really no reason that Justin Watson should be outscoring the likes of Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, Garrett Wilson, Tyler Lockett. It should just not be happening. Now, a lot of these guys are going to benefit from some different scenarios here in 2024 that could help improve what we've seen from them as of recent. Now, Devontae Adams continues to be a concern for me. I already mentioned the quarterback situation and why I don't like that. Stephon Diggs is going to head to a place where hopefully because he has less attention on him, even if it means less volume, it means more efficiency and still decent fantasy production. Tyler Lockett is going to be hit or miss, but I really think Sam Howell could end up being better for his big playability in the season if he takes the job from Geno at any point in time. And Garrett Wilson being at the end of this list absolutely should change. Now, I don't want him to go a whole lot higher because it's the same thing as Lamb, it's the same thing as Olave, but he does need to go a little bit higher, and with Aaron Rodgers being healthy, that should absolutely end up happening. All right, Headliner Nation, there is a breakdown of the top big play wide receivers from last season. And there's a lot of information chalked up in this video. So if you need to go back and pause it and read through some of those things again, absolutely do so. I love doing these types of videos where we're diving deep into the stats and then breaking it all down for you. And if you appreciate it as much as I love doing it, make sure you hit that like button so I know these types of videos are something that you want to continue to see, and make sure you let me know down in the comments below as well. But if you're new here, make sure you subscribe to the channel, turn on those bell notifications so anytime we drop new content or go live, you're gonna know about it right away. But for now, I'm getting out of here. Headliner Nation, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.